Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, as always, Mr. Patrick Farrell. Paddy, how are you this lovely rainy week?
Not rainy here. It's been actually beautifully sunny in the mighty Dublin. You can have shit weather
Well,
down.
it is bucketing down here in Cork. It's beautiful outside.
Well, Dublin is always beautiful. You know, I love looking at the Dublin mountains here. People claim they're the Wicklow Mountains. They're not. But anyway, look, we're not here to talk about the weather, Gary. We are here to finish the discussion we were having the other day. This is going to be a relatively quick podcast because Gary decided to go to the bank rather than come and do the podcast.
Imagine banks only open 6 hours per day in Ireland, 10 to 4.
Oh God, tell me about it. Like, imagine living in the dark ages. Like, I could understand if they were, shuffling gold around in the banks and you're like, you have to do stuff, but it's like, most of this stuff is online. Like, there's no need.
But do they think people don't have jobs?
Everyone
10 to 4.
complains about this. Everyone complains about this. I know, 10 to 4. Like, what? Like, anyway, look.
Anyway,
I also complain about the banks. We're here to finish the discussion. So, we were talking last week last week, I suppose, by the time you're listening to it, it was this week when we were recording it. We were talking about the topic of, is intentional weight loss harmful or an issue or potentially bad? So if you haven't listened to that podcast, definitely go back and listen to that because the rest of this is not going to make sense otherwise, right? But we finished up on basically talking about, like, is losing weight healthy, right? And for some people, it is a healthy thing, right? In terms of that's what they need to actually regain their health or to get better health for the first time in their lives. Like, you could be obese from a baby all the way through your life until, you get to a position where you're like, okay, this needs to change, right? So that's where we kind of finished up. And as we said in that podcast, like, there are certain populations where losing weight is potentially good. It's obviously also potentially harmful for other populations, like we talked about, children, elderly, people with cancer, potentially, if it's unintended weight loss without like a clear reason, blah, 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 right? So we went through all that kind of stuff, right? Now in today's podcast, we're going to continue that discussion and we want to talk about how do you navigate this area, right? So how do you navigate this area as a coach potentially? Like, because obviously, look, we're coaches, we coach people. As I said in the last podcast, I would consider myself a fat loss coach or a body composition specialist. Like, as I said, I like to get people to a lean position where they're like, look, I feel fantastic in my physique. And then I also like to get them there while having fantastic performance, right? So like, I would consider myself a relative expert in that stuff. So how do I navigate that situation, right? Because if for some people, there are clear issues with losing weight, right? And there's clear populations that shouldn't be engaging in this. Like, oftentimes, people in those populations or individuals are going to come to us that want weight loss because of whatever the like social media they've been exposed to, because of just we'll call it like some sort of internalized belief system. It's like, oh, I have to be lean because X population is lean that I enjoy, or I'm part of, or whatever, right? How do we navigate that situation, right? So, Gary, that's my initial question to you, and just to kick this off, like, how do we navigate this situation as coaches? Because I think we'll explain it through the lens of coaches, purely because we are the ones that have to talk to the majority of people with this. But in understanding our approach, you can understand a better approach for you if you are just an individual. So this is talking through the lens of coaches, but it's for the individual as well as for coaches.
Perfect. So firstly, the first part of any coaching process involves screening, and that can be of various levels of depth. So for example, if you were to look at training, one of the main things I'm always interested in is, what's your injury history like? What exercises do you find that if you build up to a certain level of volume, your shoulder starts getting sore or your knee starts getting sore? Because that prior screening gives me information about, as I roll out a training intervention, what's going to give up, what's potentially at risk, and where this person is going to run into barriers. When it comes to the psychological domain, very often that can be a little bit more difficult, because people, everyone knows that, right, if my shoulder is sore and I'm training, it's probably a bad thing, maybe, But in the fitness industry, at least, when we talk about the psychological aspects of nutrition and weight loss, some things can be perceived as normal in certain parts of the fitness population, that if we were to apply to another part of the fitness population, we'd consider that to be very abnormal. As per the previous podcast, we gave the example there of bodybuilding contest preparation, which is an extreme aspect of fitness. But basically, in that context, it's very, very normal, or it's considered to be normal for people to diet down to extreme levels of body fat at which they experience significant psychological and physiological side effects, like, loss of libido, loss of interest in things outside of the gym, low training motivation, potentially low mood, more anxiety, poor sleep, all these sorts of things. And then after the end of that diet, they get to a position where they just binge and regain all their body weight. That's considered to be normal because it's, even though there are better ways of doing it, it's just that the only goal there for that individual is to be in the best shape as possible on stage. Now, if we were to try to transfer that example and apply it to the general population for most of our clients, that would be absurd. Okay, we would never want one of our general population clients to experience a trajectory like that. Okay, so the reason I bring up that example is because understanding someone's expectations for normal events, normal feelings, normal emotions during the process is really, really important. And an example of that would be when we start to work with, let's say, a general population client who wants to lose a little bit of body fat. What we're looking for is that, there's the absence of significant disordered eating patterns, significant body image issues, and psychological health issues that go beyond just body image and dieting. Because very often what can happen is that if we don't screen for those things, we'll end up running into them as barriers down the line. Examples of that would be where, let's say, you do actually have success with someone who's dieting down to lose body fat, but their expectation was that they were going to just reach this certain body weight or level of body fat and suddenly just be happy and live a blissful existence because that was the only problem in their life. Whereas in fact, they were trying to, basically sculpt a physique to try and mask a problem that wasn't a physique problem. So they might have other things going on in their life or other psychological comorbidities that they actually need to address.
This actually goes beyond just the physique stuff. Like obviously we're talking
for sure
fat loss here, but like people do that with training all the time. Like we're like this is not a dig at runners, but you talk to runners, the vast majority of them are like, it seems anyway, like they're running away from their problems. Like they're like, oh, I like to punish myself by going on this like 3 to 5 hour run so I don't have to fucking deal with my life, And like that's just that population that they get that kind of runner's high from that. They have that ability to get away for like 3 to 5 hours, whatever. But like bodybuilders, people in the gym, they also do it. It's like, oh, I need to punish my fucking demons by going to the gym and, exercising, if you will, in the dual use of that term. They're demons, So it's like people have issues regardless. It's not just body image stuff, So you have to, as a coach, you have to dig a little bit deeper, like scratch beneath the surface, and you'll start to see these things. And it is, as I said, like really important because like it might not present as an issue at the start, but down the line, like it's probably going to come to the surface.
100%. And one of the things I try to emphasize with clients, and obviously this can be transferred to basically any domain, and that is that like you're living your life now and you have to be present with that. And the reason I say that is because like whether it's, let's say, college, for example, is a good example. People go to college and maybe they're finishing their degree and they're like, when my degree is done, I will do this, or I will get fit after my degree, or I will focus on these things after my degree. And some of that's fine. But then you have examples where, oh, I want to go and, travel the world and find myself, and then I'll live my life, and it's always these things that like, I will live my life in the future, but for now, there are other things that are stopping me from doing that. Dieting is a great example of that, because people will say, oh, I'm just going to get lean first, and then I'll start to enjoy food, and then I'll start to enjoy social activities, nourishing my relationships, etc. But that's not life. And what I try to get people to focus on is like, what are the key components of your life that you actually value, and how can we keep them in your life while you pursue health and fitness, because you are here in the now and there's no other option but that. And that might seem like it's something that goes a bit beyond the coaching domain, but I guarantee you it's something that will absolutely make your clients' lives significantly better. Because what it means is that, right, if I have to focus on the things I actually value in my life, then I have to ask myself what trade-offs I can accept within that. Because if you care, let's say, about reading, or you care about, you know, spending time with your family, or you care about going for walks at the weekend or whatever, if your extreme dietary practices or intentional weight loss are taking away from your ability to engage in those things, then now you can tell that you've actually allowed your values to slip and you're no longer living for yourself in the now. And what you have to ask yourself then is, how long am I going to accept that as a trade-off? Because very often what we see is that weight loss attempts to get to a certain level of body fat, they're very rarely completed within the 6 to 12 week period. You know, it might be that we work with a client who has overall 20 kilos of body fat to lose, let's say, and they might lose 7 in the first 12 weeks. And then we have a phase where we focus more on maintenance. And then maybe we take another couple of kilos off, and then we focus on maintenance. And then they go away and they, you know, focus on performance for a while. And then when they've done that, they eventually decide, right, I'm going to try to get these last 5 kilos off and I'm going to maintain that then for life. But that could be a multiple year period. And you can't just put your life on hold for all of that time. So would you agree with that, Paddy? Do you think that's something that's relevant to the coaching practice?
Yeah, 100%. Just directly on that, like this is a lot of the issue in the health and fitness world, where, like most things in the modern age, we want this right now. We want the, like, oh, the quick, not a quick fix necessarily. Like, even people who say, oh, I want sustainable fat loss, like, they still, when you like dig a little bit deeper, you do hear them go like, oh, well, yeah, I want sustainable fat loss, but I want to actually achieve my goal in the next 6 to 8 weeks. And it's like, you spent the last 10 years putting on this weight. You know, it's like, how do you expect to just 6 to 8 weeks? And the unfortunate thing about it is, like, if you don't provide that as a coach, or at least get them towards that, they're just going to try to go elsewhere. They're going to be like, oh, that coaching process wasn't for me, I'll go elsewhere, right? Which, this is why these kind of conversations are important, because you have to realize that, yeah, okay, you have to be able to produce results as a coach, 100%. Like, there's no two ways about it. We're a results-driven industry, right? But you have to also give the client a little bit of what they actually need, not just what they want, right? And that can turn into a multi-year process, like Gary said. And this is why we, in our coaching process, not to kind of like, you know, laud ourselves up, be like, oh, we're fantastic or whatever, but like, we really focus on, like, let's actually ingrain healthful habits, and let's actually build good practices, which we'll touch on later on. But like, let's actually focus on those kind of things, so that, like, we'll call them health promoting habits, so that you actually go away from the coaching process realizing, yeah, okay, this is a multi-year process, but I actually know how to go about it, rather than, like you said earlier on, where it's like, oh, I'll just stick to this for the next 20 weeks. I'll hate myself. I will lose all my friends, won't talk to my family. I'll be eating out of Tupperware, blah, blah, blah. And then I'll be happy because I'll have the physique of my dreams. And then I'll start doing all the other things that I wanted to do, you know, day to day. It's like, that's, you like, how do you expect to sustain that if you build this practice that gets you results? Yeah, look, whatever, you lose the 10 kilos, whatever you want to lose, but you've never actually been able to sustain that in the way you want to live. You've never actually built practices in a real life setting. You've built practices in this, like, extreme, oh, I stick to this exactly for the next 10 weeks, 20 weeks, whatever it is, and that's all I know. Like, that's not a sustainable practice. That's not going to get you lifelong results, which, yeah, look, that can be fantastic if that's what you want. You're like, oh, I have a holiday in 12 weeks. I just want to be shredded for it. I don't really care at the back end of that. Most people are not in that camp. Most people are like, oh yeah, if I'm going to put in all this work to lose this weight, or to, you know, get this fat loss goal, or whatever it is, you don't want to just go, oh, that's the end of it all, I'm done, you know, I'll regain it all back, I'll just go back to exactly what I have been doing, you know. Like, you can clearly understand that that's not going to lead to optimal results long term, you know. Do you have anything else to say on that, Gary?
No, that sounds good to me.
Fantastic, right? So, to kind of put this into a little bit more of a clearer framework about how you go about doing this for yourself, because like Gary touched on some key points there. The first thing is, we want to do some sort of screening, right? And you can do this yourself. You can actually analyze, like, okay, what are my beliefs? What are my thoughts around all this stuff? Like, is this actually beneficial for my long-term progress? Like, am I, like, again, you can do it to yourself, but it's obviously a little bit easier if you have some outside person doing it for you, in terms of, you can analyze whether, oh, I have this history of binge eating, or I have this history of, all or nothing mindset. I have this history of whatever it is, right? You can do that yourself. You can identify these things. The hard part then is understanding a plan of action to go about doing that. And the first thing that, and like everyone learns this as a personal trainer or a coach or, nutritionist or whatever, right? Everyone learns this. The first step after doing this initial screening and going like, okay, we've identified all of this person's metrics that are relevant, right? The next step after that is like goal setting, right? Because we need to actually set goals that are realistic. We need to set goals that are actually achievable. And in trying to set those goals, you actually understand that individual a lot more in terms of their actual thought process. Like someone might go, oh, here are my goals, right? They lay them all out. Let's say we have a top 5, top 3, whatever it is, right? And then you read through those goals. Like the way we do it, like obviously not with all clients, depends on the situation, but the way we do it is like, here, what's the overall goal? Like here, let's say it's body composition. We want to improve body composition. It's like, what does that actually look like? What's the specific goals within that in terms of, it's like, oh, I want to weigh 90 kilos. I want to have 6% body fat. Like, let's actually dial in on specifics in terms of like, what does improved body composition look like for you? Like, let's get hard numbers here, right? And then let's actually break that down into some sort of like process goals. Like, what are you going to have to do to achieve that? Like, again, if it's like, okay, I want to get to 90 kilos, whatever, right? Then it's like, okay, we're going to have to build some muscle. You only weigh 80 kilos now. So we're gonna have to build some muscle. And in doing that, we're probably going to gain body fat. So it's like, okay, we have to be able to accept that. And you have to explain all that. So you have to break down the specific goals into the different processes that you have to engage in daily, weekly, monthly, whatever it is, so that you can actually achieve your goal. And then what you, like I always do anyway with my clients, is like, I ask them why they want that goal, right? There's a few other things we ask as well, but we're not gonna give away all the secrets. But we ask them why, right? Because this is actually really important, because once you've gone, okay, this is my overall goal, right? And like, it usually takes a while to kind of refine this down, it's like, let's actually refine this until it's actually really dialed in, right? Then it's like, what's the specifics of that, right? Again, really dial this in. Like, you can't just be like, oh, I want to lose weight. That's not specific. It's like, what are we specifically looking for? Like, you want to lose 15 pounds? Okay, 15 pounds. Like, are you going to be happy then? Like, how do you know you're going to be happy then? Have you ever weighed that much? Have you, like, what's the story there? We have to actually dive into that, because you could just have this arbitrary number in your head and be defining yourself based on that number. You're like, oh, 70 kilos. That's what I have to weigh to feel validated. And it's like, have you ever weighed 70 kilos? Oh yeah, I have. Did you feel validated then? No. Okay, so like, why do you think it's going to be different this time? Whereas for other people, it might be like, oh yeah, actually, I know at 70 kilos, that's where I feel like body confident. That's where I feel great about myself. That's where I feel like my health metrics are in a great place. That's obviously better then, because we were like, okay, well, we know you've been here before. We know that you feel better at this position, blah, blah, blah. Like, we can actually dive in and think about that a little bit more like coherently, because you've been there before, right? So we know what to expect, right? Or at least, potentially what to expect. But we dial in those specifics. But then you ask the why, right? Because this is where you really start to dive into the psyche of an individual. And again, you can do this as a coach and you can do this as yourself, right? It's the same process, right? When you're doing all this, like, I always say to my clients as well, I'm like, try not to do just one word answers, because this is very tempting to just kind of like, oh, do this exercise is like, oh yeah, like, why do I want it? Oh, I want to feel good with my body. It's like, that's not a why. Like that's like, let's actually like dial into, why do you want this? Like, why do you not feel good at your current body? It's like let's dive into that. And once you start doing that and start understanding that why, it actually does become a lot easier to, first of all, coach someone, because then you can keep going back to that kind of exercises you've done, this sheet where you're like, okay, look, you said that you'd be happy at 80 kilos. We're 80 kilos now. You said you're not happy. You say you want to lose more. You want to do whatever. It's like, why do you think that is? Why do you think there's this like disconnect between your previous goals and this? And then you start really diving into it. And they're like, oh, well, actually, I didn't work on my relationship with my family, and that was actually really important to me. I've actually grown further away from them because of all these health habits that I'm engaging in, blah, blah, blah. So it's like, once we start doing that and really start like pulling it apart, you start seeing all these individual strands, and where someone thought their goals were, you actually start to realize it's like, no, these are not actually my goals. This is not what I actually want from my life. It's like, okay, this is a nice addition. Like, yeah, okay, I have a shredded body. I have this ideal physique, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, you aren't happy as a result of that. That's very often the case. Now, obviously, very often it's not the case. It's very often that's like, we have, you got your physique of your dreams and you're like, yeah, I'm great, feel happy, content, blah, blah, blah. But we have to, as coaches, try to identify that ahead of time. because you don't want to have a case of like, oh, you said you wanted to weigh 80 kilos, we got you to 80 kilos and you're still unhappy. It's like, you don't want to deliver a service that makes someone just as unhappy as when they came to you. It's like, you want to deliver a service that's like, okay, now you're actually in a great position. And this is the hard part, because you as an individual, you probably have never actually really dived into your own goals. And you as a coach, if you're trying to coach someone that has never really like, dove in deep to their goals, it's like you have to take them on kind of face value in terms of, they say, oh, I want to be 80 kilos. You have to kind of take that as like, that's the goal that they're presenting with. That's what we want to achieve. You have to give them a little bit of what they need and what they want. So this is what they want, but you don't know what they actually need until you actually start pulling that apart and really start diving into a little bit more into like what they are actually thinking. And this is really hard to do, because like, if you are a personal trainer, like obviously you're not trained in like psychology, and the unfortunate thing about a lot of psychology is well, first of all, especially if you're on social media or whatever, they are really bad for like gatekeeping, in terms of, it's like, oh, you shouldn't talk about like mental health, you shouldn't talk about anything like this. And it's like, right, first of all, we need to explain, or we need to push out a better conversation, and like, yeah, okay, cool, like if you're unqualified to even talk about this, you have no idea what the fuck is going on, like, yeah, don't speak about it. But if it's like you are trying to help people in a coherent way, like, you can talk about psychology, and obviously the more educated you are on the topic, the better. But this is a hard thing for personal trainers to do, because the psychology of a personal trainer is not the psychology of their client very often. Like obviously there are some alignment. Like if you're a competitive bodybuilder and all your clients are competitive bodybuilders, it's like, okay, look, you're very congruent with the thought process, so it's like, you understand exactly what they're thinking oftentimes, oftentimes not as well, that does happen. So it's a little bit easier. But if you're training someone that potentially, like, say for example, like me, I'm not looking for 30 kilos of fat loss, like I don't have 30 kilos of fat to lose, So if I'm talking to someone that has 30 kilos of fat to lose and they're like, oh, I want to lose 30 kilos of fat, like I have to kind of change my thought process to try to get into their mind and really start to peel apart the strands that connect that stuff. And again, like we've done like, psychology training to some extent. Like I'm currently doing like a CBT course and stuff, but like, it's still hard if you are trying to do this yourself, and it's still hard if you are a coach who even has, I'm sure it's still hard for psychologists, if it wasn't hard for them, they'd be like fixing everyone, but what are your thoughts on that, Gary? I've been rambling.
I agree. I mean, I don't have too much else to add. I think it's a fairly clear point. I think it's pretty difficult to operate as a coach without trying to practice some sort of psychology. You have to have psychology, particularly that related to behavior change as part of your coaching practice. And I think that if you were to stay in your practice or stay in your scope of practice to such an extreme that anytime a psychological component came up, you just wouldn't be able to operate as a coach at all. So I think there's a lot, to be fair, of psychological lessons as it relates to coaching and behavior change that can be learned purely from just listening to people and actually being attentive and recognizing that your own experience doesn't necessarily reflect that of everyone else. And you do just learn those things through experience. Like over time, as you help people with fat loss, what you start to notice is that there is a significant number of people, or there are a significant number of people who just get to a point where, yeah, they've lost all the body fat, but now they're like directionless. They don't know what they're aiming at. They're not particularly satisfied with what they achieve. And now they're thinking, oh, well, maybe I'll just gain a load of weight and try to gain loads of muscle, and maybe that'll then kind of make me feel good. Maybe that's what I need to do. So just having those conversations with people, it can be difficult, particularly if you're, I think, a younger trainer. And where this becomes, I think, more challenging is if you're a young trainer, often if you're working with the opposite sex, regardless of which direction that's in, and then also if there's a significant age gap or perceived difference in professional status. Like, for example, if you're an 18-year-old new personal trainer just qualified, and I don't know, you're working with a lawyer who's 40 years old, and they perceive you to just be of lesser status, because that does come up, not very often, but it does happen. That can be one area where it might be difficult to break down those barriers, to have those psychological conversations about, you know, someone's goals, values, etc. But I think that's where developing a good rapport and relationship with your clients becomes so important, because that's when people start to open up about those things. So despite the fact that it may not come up initially, what I often do is, a few weeks into the coaching process, I try to revisit the person's initial goals. It's generally after the first 4 weeks or so. You know, I'll say, right, it looks like you've made some progress towards the goals that you initially stated, but I just want to follow up a little bit on something you said in your questionnaire, because you said you wanted to lose body fat, but you also put muscle gain as high in your priority, and you also put performance as high in the priority. So where's your real focus, and why are we aiming at what we're aiming at? And I think if you give it the time to develop the relationship, I think that's really where those conversations open up.
Yeah, and I think this is really important, because that kind of first like 4 weeks, like a lot of the coaching process is basically just getting people to engage in healthful habits, right? And then it becomes more about like, okay, now we need to actually refine in on the specifics for your goal, right? And this is a nice little segue to the kind of next bit that we just want to touch on, because like as a coach, there's a few things that you're kind of looking out for. First of all, you're looking out for these kind of obsessions, right? Someone's like, oh, I'm really obsessed with, you know, body checking. Like they're like, oh, I pinch my fat on my hip or stomach or whatever. You're like, oh, you're looking out for that. You're like, this is something that needs to be investigated a little bit deeper. Now, that might be something that you need to refer out for if someone's like, you know, has properly developed like body image issues. You know, you might need to refer out for that, right? But you can educate someone to tell them, you know, just if you start noticing these things where it's like, okay, look, this is not a good behavior to have long term. You know, you're constantly checking yourself, constantly like pulling up your shirt, looking at your abs in the mirror, that kind of stuff. It's like, this is not good long term for your psychological health, because like what happens if you're like, oh, all of a sudden you had a higher sodium meal, you know, last night you were out, whatever, you know, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, my abs have faded here. It's like, that's probably going to negatively impact your self-worth then, if you know you've built up this process of like every single day checking your abs in the mirror. You know, so it's like we need to you know dial in those things quickly. You know, the same with like, you know, obsessing over the scale. Like if you have someone, you're getting them to weigh themselves just to see where calories are at, to see how body composition is changing, etc., and they're like really impacted by the numbers on the scale. It's like, okay, well, we need to be aware of that, and we need to change our processes, because like I'm not going to get you to weigh yourself constantly if it is this, you know, fucking Russian roulette type thing where it's like, you know, the scale says one thing and all of a sudden your entire day is ruined, you know, your whole psyche is broken, and then the scale says something completely opposite the next day and you're like, oh, I'm elated, you know, this is great. It's like, this is like this kind of fucking manic depressive inducing device, you know. It's like that's less than ideal, you know. So it's like, okay, look, we need to take a step back from that. Let's not use that as our, you know, tool that defines our characteristics and self-worth and whatever. It's like, let's take a step back from that. Like I personally, I'm like, look, I want you to be able to step on a scale. So I'm like, yeah. To me, I'm like, I don't want people to be like afraid of the scales. I think that's a bad approach overall mentally, to basically fear a tool. You know, it's like, it's not ideal, you know. Like that's like saying like, oh, I'm scared of my phone, you know, or a calculator or whatever, you know. It's like, this is not a great thing to, you know, be scared of, right? So we want to eventually build that through some sort of like, you know, exposure therapy. But initially we might be like, right, look, we're not looking at that. That's just, it's causing, you know, bad, you know, messages to go on in your brain. So let's just dial back from that, right? So we're looking out for these kind of obsessions within a client, right? Again, could be scales, could be whatever metric. They could be like, you know, bicep size. It could be, I don't fucking know. Like there's loads of things that people will get obsessed over. So we're looking out for those things, because obviously, look, if we're trying to elicit fat loss in a healthful manner, like we need to be aware of these psychological issues. And it might be a case that, okay, we initially were going for a fat loss diet, but look, we've clearly noted that every time you do this, we try to look for fat loss, you get obsessed over these metrics. So we need to deal with those metrics, that obsession, or rather, first, before we look at the fat loss. Because we're not going to go for the fat loss if all of a sudden, every time we try to go on a calorie deficit, you get this kind of like obsessive compulsive disorder about like body checking, about like looking at yourself in the mirror, about like whatever. It's like, you're not in the mental health space to do this. Like Gary said earlier on, it's kind of like a similar position where if someone came to you and they're like, oh yeah, I have a torn labrum and my fucking hip is broken, my fucking knee is broken. You'd be like, okay, well, right now is not the time to be really pushing performance like in the gym. Like we need to focus on like rehab first, You know, we need to get that process underway. We need to get that process done before we can really start developing these other characteristics that you want to go for. And it's the exact same stuff with all this kind of psychology, where it's like, look, if you have an eating disorder or disordered eating, or these kind of disordered eating thoughts or disordered thoughts, it's like, you need to get those sorted first. And oftentimes that's not within the scope of a coach, you know? Like, I know, like, I've had clients where I know you've had clients before where it's like, look, we start the process, you're 4 weeks in, you're whatever. And then all of a sudden you're like, look, I actually can't help you right now. You need to go to someone else. We started the process. We know what needs to be done in terms of like where your goals are, in terms of what needs to be done with training, what needs to be done with nutrition, but you're not in the mental headspace right now to do that, right? So we need to actually deal with getting in the right mental headspace. And to do that, we need to refer out. We need to go to a psychologist. We need to go to, you know, I don't know, maybe it is some sort of therapist. Maybe you have a therapist as a client, or, you know, as an individual, you're like, I like to go to these because I've gone to them before and I've got good results with them, whatever, you know. It's like, we need to refer out in some way, right? Because we can't just go, oh, let's hammer fat loss or let's hammer progression in whatever goal it is if it's leading to a deterioration in your mental health. It's just not ideal, right? Or any other or a health metric. You know, it's like we're going for fat loss and I don't know, you start noticing that your, I don't know, fucking triglycerides, your cholesterol, your fucking whatever is through the roof now. You know, it's like, okay, we need to reevaluate our process. We need to take a step back and, you know, see what's going on here, because we're not just going to keep hammering this if it's leading to ill health, right? And that brings me to the next point, which is, and again, this is still in this kind of first 4-week period where you're just focusing on health habits. And this is the next point where it's like, we're really just, especially initially, we're not focusing on fat loss. You know, if you have someone that comes to you, they say, oh, I want fat loss, or they come to me, I want fat loss. Most of the time, the first 2 to 4 weeks, we're just focusing on good health habits. We're just getting like a sustainable approach built. We're just getting the kind of foundation set. You know, it's like, okay, look, we need to, I don't know, maybe it's tracking calories, maybe it's, you know, portion control, I don't know, whatever it is with the diet. We're doing something to get it on track, to get it in a place where it's like, okay, look, we're in a good position with this, right? Same with training. Maybe they need to train 3, 4, 5 times per week. It's like, let's actually just start doing that and let's see what challenges come up. And then when we've set that foundation and we focus on just those health promoting habits, as again, like these could be eating more vegetables, could be eating more protein, could be drinking more water, whatever. We're focusing on these good health promoting habits that we know we've talked about before. Everyone knows what good health promoting habits are at this stage, right? And we're not focusing on fat loss promoting habits, you know, like, yes, 100%. If we engage in these health promoting habits, generally what happens, especially if we've got, you know, a relatively good position with calories and stuff, we get fat loss, you know, but the focus isn't necessarily just fat loss straight out the gate. It's like, let's get into a rhythm with just good health habits, getting to sleep on time, eating well, training well, blah, 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 all of that stuff. Let's get that done. And then we can start switching a little bit towards like, okay, this is a fat loss specific habit in terms of, okay, you want to, let's say we're using a portion control method. It's like, okay, you want to kind of stop eating that when you're about 80% full. You know, it's like, that's going to be a fat loss promoting habit rather than like, okay, look, you just eat until you're full. Like, they're different habits, even though it's like, you know, we're not specifically tracking calories or whatever, you know? So it's like, let's actually just get those good habits in place, right? And this is a really important thing if you are a coach or you are an individual that's coaching yourself. Like, the vast majority of the time, what you want to focus on are the habits that you're engaging in rather than the results, right? The results, you can't predict the results, right? Yeah, obviously you can to some extent predict the results because, you know, we know if you engage in a calorie deficit, you're going to get some weight loss. You know, again, we've talked about that stuff before, so you can go back and listen to those podcasts. But we can't actually dictate the exact result. Like, I can't say, oh, this exact amount of calorie deficit is going to lead to this exact amount of fat loss in this exact amount of time, because that's not how like human metabolism works, because you get this like upregulation of some systems, downregulation of other systems. No 2 days are the exact same. Your sleep isn't going to be the exact same day to day. Your hydration, your nutrition, like nothing is going to be like exact same, right? So like, we can't predict that. Like, it's not like fucking Newtonian physics where it's like, this does this reaction here, boom, you know? It's like, well, it is like that to an extent, but we can't predict it because we don't have the measurement tools to be able to predict that well, you know? So we focus on the habits. What are the habits that we're engaging in that we know if we continue these over time, we will get to the results that we want? And this is also important because what we want to do is celebrate those habits rather than celebrating the results, especially if you're a coach, because this is something that I would consider, is the dividing line, that the first barrier dividing line between a good coach and, I'm not saying a bad coach, but just a mediocre to like lesser coach, whatever, right? It's a coach that celebrates results, they're mediocre to bad, whatever, right? A coach that celebrates good habits, they're a good coach, right? And the reason for that is, again, like what happens, like say, for example, like this is me, right? Example last night, right? So this week I've just engaged in a fat loss diet. So I'm in a little bit of a calorie deficit. So the first 2 days, lost a kilo, right? So between those 2 days, half kilo the first day, half kilo the next day, right? This obviously just water, glycogen, whatever, right? Then last night had still within my calories, still at the exact same calories, macros, etc. Last night had a meal, higher salt, right? Today weighed myself, boom, right? Guess what? Up a kilo again, right? So now if I'm focused on purely results, right? Say someone's coaching me and I go, oh fuck man, I'm up a kilo, if I'm focusing purely on results, then we potentially start changing our habits, because I look at only that result. It's like, oh, you're up a kilo. That initial kilo that we lost, you've after fucking it up, we need to drop calories again. So we're going to chase that initial rate of loss of half a kilo per day, which is unrealistic. And we're going to drop calories by 250 now. We need to speed this up, right? That's clearly not a beneficial thing, because I know I'll weigh myself tomorrow and I'll be the exact same weight I was yesterday. It's like this. It's just transient fluid, right? Or at least I hope. But you know what I mean? It's like that's all it is, right? So we need to focus on the habits that we've engaged in, because then we can actually more easily understand the actual results that we're getting. And also, you don't have control over the results. You have control over the habits. So let's focus on the stuff that we actually have control over rather than the stuff that we don't have control over. Like I can't control how my body reacts to a little bit more sodium or a little bit less sodium, or how much water I drank, or like I can't control how my body reacts to that. It's just going to do it itself, right? I can't control how much or how fast I liberate fat, right? Like how fast I oxidize it. I can't control any of that stuff, right? But I can control how much I eat. So I focus on the habits, such as controlling how much I eat, right? Or how much I sleep, or how much I exercise, or do my NEAT, and all that kind of stuff. So I can control those things. And as a coach, that's what you should be focusing on, because what you don't want to get into this habit of doing where it's like, oh, look, you have a fat loss client and they're like, oh, you lost a kilo this week. Great work. You're really, that's are really happy with that kilo of weight loss. It's like, okay, you might be as a coach really happy with that because it fits your like plan, your timeline of like, this is where we want to be, but you can't just celebrate that actual fat loss, because that's not in the control of the client, right? The thing that's in the control of the client is the habits. So we focus on celebrating the habits that they've engaged in so that we can actually get the results continually. Because again, we don't want a situation, and this is what happens the vast majority of the time with people that are dieting. They focus on the results. They get caught up in this obsession over the metrics where it's like, look, I'll step on the scales. Fuck me, I'm up a kilo today, or whatever it is. Shit the bed. I'm going to fucking reduce calories, throw it all out the window. That's what we're done, right? We're done with this diet. Dieting doesn't work for me. Like something's going to happen like that. You're going to have this immediate response if all we're focused on is the results rather than the actual habits. So do you have anything to say on that, Gary?
Yeah, just to I guess add a little bit of a nuance to the kind of not complementing results. There are some situations where you have to, and this what I kind of refer to this as like qualified compliments. So, for example, this is a classic one that will come up where a client will check in and they'll say, hey Gary, nailed my calories this week. I think, really tried to dial in everything as per our conversation last week, got my steps up and everything, all sessions done, but weight's still not really moving. So, they might be perceiving that they're actually not getting the results that they should be getting for the habits that they've, successfully carried out. And in that case, what I'll, say to someone is that, I'll try to reflect on the actual results. So, for example, they may have actually lost half a kilo, but that doesn't look that significant to them. And if we look at the kind of 4-week rate of fat loss, they may very well be on track with the exact rate that we've been targeting, but they just mightn't perceive that it's a lot. So in that case, what I'd say is, look, you've been losing an average of half a kilo per week. these are the ranges I normally aim for with clients. So I'm actually really happy with your rate of fat loss. I think the results you're achieving are actually, you know, fantastic and really on par with what I would expect out of this process. Here are the reasons that I think that this is an appropriate rate. Here's why we wouldn't want to lose less. Here's why we wouldn't want to lose more. And just a reminder for you that any change in your body weight that we've seen, this is all the result of you nailing all of the habits that we've discussed. So you're doing a really great job with that. I just need you to keep on doing that. And if there's a change in the rate of fat loss, then that's when we'll start to make some changes. Is that fair enough? And those types of things, that gives the person a real sense of control over what's actually going on, rather than just, you know, just complimenting the change in weight one week, and then if it doesn't change the next week, well, now they've failed because the weight didn't change, because that's all you complimented. So I try to put those two things together and really save those celebrations of results themselves for when the person may not actually be seeing it. And another easy example there is photos. So someone's weight might have been the same for 6 weeks, particularly if they're newer to training, but when we actually look at their photos, it's very clear their body composition has drastically changed, but they may not be able to actually see that because they live with themselves every day, so the changes are very subtle. So again, getting the person to zoom in on the results in those cases can actually be really helpful, because it reinforces the desire to keep, you know, nailing those habits.
100%. And this is another thing, just quasi related to that. Like, when we're looking at habits, because like realistically, the vast majority of behavior change is just the habits that you engage in, right? And like, if you're a coach, basically what you're coaching is behavior change. And if you are trying to elicit a change in yourself, what you're trying to do is change your behaviors. You know, it's like, it all comes down to behaviors, which all comes down to habits, right? So one of the things that we often do is like, we focus on these additive behaviors rather than stuff that needs to be taken away. It's like, okay, let's focus initially on like adding a little bit more protein, right? Let's focus initially on like adding a little bit more vegetables. Let's focus on like these things that we can add in, so that we're in a position where you don't feel deprived, because that is a huge part of this whole process, where especially with dieting down, where people feel really, really deprived. You know, it's like, oh, I can't eat these foods, or I can't do this, or I can't do that. Like, they've focused on this subtractive model where it's like, let's take away bad habits. And 100% that needs to happen at some stage, but that doesn't necessarily need to be the first intervention, right? And I'm in 100% agreement with you there, Gary, in terms of thinking like, sometimes we do actually need to focus on the results, you know, where it's like, look, the results you're getting are good. Like, that needs to be reinforced, you know, especially if we are on track, if we're in a position where we're getting good results for what we deem as being a good rate of fat loss, for example, because people can obviously get discouraged, you know, where it's like, look, we're focusing on these additive behaviors, we're focusing on these good behaviors, we're focusing on XYZ, we're doing that, but I was expecting 2 kilos of fat loss every single week. That's what we got the first 2 weeks, you know, 2 kilos the first week, 2 kilos the second week. So I was presuming that was going to happen going forward, right? Because people get into that mindset, and then all of a sudden the next week they lose 1.5 kilos, and they're like, oh fuck, I obviously did something wrong. You know, the next week they lose 1 kilo, and they're like, right, that's it, I'm going to really just hammer home, really just focus on, you know, eating less, moving more. And it's like, look, you started off really, really fast. That was the issue. It wasn't that like, you know, the approach is bad. It's just so that it was too good at the start. Like, we were probably in too much of a calorie deficit at the start. And obviously there's a lot of like glycogen, water, etc., that comes off after that initial like calorie reduction. So we have to factor that in. So like, you're bang on track. You're actually ahead of schedule at this rate of fat loss. And like, we have to talk about that rate of fat loss. We have to make that a realistic target. We have to explain that to people. And again, this is why this first 4 weeks of the process is really just about getting into a good rhythm with things before we really like dive into like, okay, let's, like you said, like reassess your goals. Let's realign like how fast we're going. Let's say you wanted performance and you wanted fat loss. It's like, okay, look, we're going to see a decrease in performance if we continue at this rate of fat loss of 2 kilos per week. It's like, are you okay with that? Because we obviously have to, you know, dial in on that. Like, those different things, we have to be very specific about our goals, and we have to be very specific about like our priorities overall, right? So before we just get on to kind of like the final point, which is just talking about beliefs and that kind of stuff, one of the things that is really hard to navigate if you are a trainer yourself is that like you basically want to promote this kind of health at every size approach, right? This haze approach, right? The unfortunate thing about that is like if you are a coach trying to read this, like read up on this stuff, a lot of it is really like ideologically driven, right? And it's the same on both sides. Like if all you consume is people are saying that like, oh, fat people, they have no fucking morals, they have no self-discipline, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, you can clearly see that that's like ideologically driven, right? But unfortunately, when you try to navigate through the opposite side of that in terms of you want to understand how to help people like at every size, you want to understand how to promote health promoting habits at every size. You don't want to be like, all right, look, like this client might want fat loss, but let's actually just get into a good healthful position first of all before we actually focus on fat loss, because that's the more important thing here. It's like, yeah, okay, the fat loss is potentially a health promoting habit or result for an individual where it's like, look, you need to lose weight because your doctor has told you to, because you have XYZ whatever disease or illness that is going to benefit from this. And 100% we need to focus on that. But the things that we need to focus on to do that are the health promoting habits. So let's actually focus on those regardless of the individual, because they're the key to it all, right? But the unfortunate thing is when you read a lot of this stuff, it becomes ideologically driven. Like if you read up, like I can guarantee you right now, if you type in "is intentional fat loss bad" into Google, like you will be greeted by hundreds of articles, and you can clearly see that these articles are ideologically driven because they use words like sexist, classist, like it's basically buzzword bingo. Like they're capitalism, objectifying, fat phobic, colonialist, decolonize. Like they'll use words like that, or like they'll say stuff like diets don't work, or they'll be like, oh, you have this internalized fat phobia, or like they'll talk about oppression and different things. And like, look, we're not talking about those different potential issues. They are potential issues for different subsections of the population, but we're trying to talk about an actual issue here, a singular issue. It's not like we can't just correlate it with all these other ideologies that you have. Like imagine someone was like, oh, like if you came across a website and they were like, oh yeah, fat people are just really, really bad, we shouldn't have them in society. Like in my utopian vision of society where we've killed all the Jews and we've got like this Aryan master race. Like if you started reading that stuff, you'd be like, oh, this is clearly ideologically driven, right? So when you start reading it on the opposite side, it's like, okay, you should realize that this is clearly ideologically driven. What we want to do is, well, I was going to say meet in the middle. Maybe we don't want to meet in the middle where we kill, I don't know, half the Jews. Like that's just maybe not that, right? But we want to kind of get some actual reality to the situation where we want to focus on health promoting habits. That's the key to this, right? And you can have this haze approach, this health at every size approach, where we just focus on these health promoting habits, and that's going to be beneficial regardless of the end outcome then in terms of the results, in terms of like whether we get fat loss or not. Because if you have someone that works with you for whatever 12 weeks, we'll say, right, and you can be guaranteed at the end of that 12 weeks of working with you, they're in a position where they're like, oh, you know what, I've completely transformed my habits. I now get great sleep. I now actually am hydrated. I now get enough protein. I now eat my vegetables. I now do X, Y, and Z, all these different health promoting habits. They're like, I exercise, I do whatever. It's like, even if they didn't lose a single pound, you can be pretty much guaranteed that they're going to be healthier as a result of those habits, right? So we need to focus on those habits rather than the actual result overall. Do you have anything to say on that, Gary?
No, I'm happy with that.
Fantastic. Right. The final thing then, and this is one thing that I'm like, look, this is kind of outside the scope of the practice of a personal trainer, and it's kind of outside the scope of everyone. Like if you go to a psychologist, it's outside their scope as well. So like, I don't know who you go to for this, the fucking Dalai Lama maybe, but basically what you want to do to help your clients is help them find meaning and purpose in their lives, right? And like you want to basically get them to find fulfillment in other avenues of their life rather than just exercise or their body composition. Like what's their spirituality like? What's their emotional connections like? What's their like meaning and purpose in life? It's like those kind of things. It's hard to coach that stuff, but it is good to bring it up, right? And like you said this before, Gary, it's like your body should be the least interesting thing about you. It's like this should not be the defining characteristic of you. Like even for athletes or like people that make a living, like basically like selling their body. And I don't mean like prostitution. I mean like, you sell pictures on Instagram, basically, for ads or whatever. It's like it still shouldn't be the most interesting thing about your body. Like you can imagine, right? You go up to someone, you're like, oh my God, they have the most beautiful face, the most beautiful body, whatever your ideal opposite sex, right? You're just like, right, that's what I want. Or sorry, I shouldn't say opposite sex, the gender that you find attractive, right? And you're like, this is the person that I would like, my ideal person, and imagine going up to them and being like, right, this is my ideal. And then you talk to them and there's literally nothing going on up there. They have no personality. They can't converse about any topics with you. It's just, they just look good, right? No one wants that. Not a single person wants that. You might think that you want that, but in reality, you don't want that, right? So you need to actually develop more than just, oh, I have a good body, right? It's not a sustainable thing to base your entire personality off, because look, you're going to get old, right? You're not going to have a good body forever, right? What happens if you get injured or in a car crash, whatever? It's like if your entire personality is defined by this one characteristic, you're in a bad position, right? Like you have to have hobbies. What do you enjoy? And I don't mean like, oh, I go to the gym as a hobby. I'm like, look, that's exercise. Everyone should be doing exercise in some form or other. It's like that's not a hobby, That's actually get it.
It's basics, man.
Yeah, literally, it's just self-maintenance. That's like saying brushing your teeth is your hobby. It's like this is just basic self-maintenance. It's like showering is my hobby. Like you wouldn't say that stuff, right? So it's like exercise is not a hobby. Like yeah, okay, 100%. We can argue about sports potentially being a hobby. Maybe you're into the sports. Maybe you watch like different teams or you follow whatever. It's like, okay, cool. We can argue semantics all day, but exercise in some form or other is a key defining like characteristic of just life. But anyway, you have to help your clients to some extent, or yourself, if you're coaching yourself, find some meaning in your life. And the way I always talk to people about this. I'm like, look, realistically, just count up all the hours that you spend thinking about health and fitness stuff, right? Especially if it's not your career, right? Let's say it's, or not health and fitness stuff, we'll talk about your body composition, where you're like, look, oh, I wish I was this weight, or I wish I lost this fat or whatever. Let's just say 5 hours per week in total. You think about this stuff, you sit down at your desk, you feel a little bit of roll of fat there, and you're like, oh, I don't want that, whatever it is, any single time that you're thinking about this stuff, right? Add up all those hours. Again, let's just say it's 5 hours, right? If you were to just charge yourself your hourly rate in work, where it's like, look, say work pays you 20 euro, 50 euro, whatever it is per hour, right? If you were to just charge yourself that every single week, that's how much you're investing into this stuff already. Because look, you've just wasted 5 hours every single week thinking about this stuff, right? So if you're charging yourself, if work is willing to pay you that, and like I would argue that it's more important time, where it's like it's usually your free time. It's usually the stuff where you're doing it on your own. It's like then you just become self-conscious, or you're thinking about this stuff, and then you are like, if work was to call you in for those times, it would pay you overtime. That's what they would do, right? So you're charging yourself that much every single week. So don't let that continue. Like, stop charging yourself that much. Stop charging yourself to 5 hours, 10 hours, 20 hours, how much it is for you, however much it is for you, right? Stop charging yourself that each week. Actually free up those 5 hours. Not necessarily like just get rid of all these thoughts, because that's not realistic as well. Right? Let's actually engage in helpful habits that get you the results that you want, but let's also actually address these thoughts that you're having. Maybe again, it is you need to go to a psychologist. Maybe it is you just need to talk to another human about these thoughts that you're having that are rattling around in your head. And as soon as you verbalize them, you realize you're like, oh, wait, actually, hold on. I would never speak to my friend like this, or I would never speak to my family like this. Why am I having these thoughts about myself? Like these really negative thoughts, being like, you're useless because you have a little bit of fat on your body, those kind of things. It's like, verbalize them, and all of a sudden they become real. And like, we've done this before, where like, we talked about like words being magic, and how like, you actually speak these words, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I can actually interpret these thoughts a lot better, right? It's fucking half the benefit of therapy. You might need to go to a psychologist for this. They might be the one that can help you, but it is something to consider, right? And again, as a coach, getting people to realize that their body is not the most important thing about them is really, really fucking beneficial. Like I always say to them, like, look, body composition, even improving your health, all that kind of stuff. Like, it's not your higher purpose on earth. for the vast majority of people. This is not what they were put here on earth. Whether you believe in like a supreme deity or whatever, it's like there's a more meaning to your life than just chasing like, oh, I got a vein on my abs now. You know, it's like that's not your meaning and purpose here. Anyway, Gary, do you mind to say on that?
No, other than just projecting our worldview onto people for them to adopt, I don't think there's anything else I could add, really. You know, do whatever you want. I don't care. Well, I do care within reason. But yeah, no, I mean, look, live your life. Don't let your body be the most interesting thing about you. Even in cases where it may seem like it is, like for bodybuilders, if you actually look at what people find interesting about bodybuilders, it's actually not just the physique. It's the fact that, wow, you're able to really commit to something and to stick to it and to, you know, despite how you're feeling, you're able to keep showing up and doing these things. Like that's what I always found fascinating about bodybuilding. And when I first got into the gym, like what I attribute like many, you know, successful steps since then too is actually that ability to start to discipline myself and to show up to the gym and to get my nutrition in order, like getting all that in order at a young age and starting to organize my life. Like that helped me in so many other ways in terms of like our business, in terms of college, etc. So it's not even in those extreme cases where it would seem that your body's the most interesting thing, it's actually all the other aspects that have come as a side effect of that you'll find that people really do admire. So yeah, I mean,
You see that on social media, like you see these people with objectively better physiques, right? And like in bodybuilding, I mean, like objectively better physiques, and they'll compete, and the person with the better physique, they'll win, right? But they might have like, you know, 20 fucking social media followers because they don't post stuff. They're not interesting. Like maybe they post a set in the gym. Whereas you have someone else with, you know, potentially worse genetics in terms of like their actual like objective physique, even though it's a subjective sport, like there's criteria. So they say it's subjective, but it is somewhat objective as well. So it's like the person with the lesser physique, they might get like this huge following because they post regularly, they post like interesting things, they post the process, they post their thoughts about different things. It's like they're more than just their body. Whereas the person that just posts a physique pic of like, you know, oh, I'm 12 weeks out now, or I'm whatever, it's like they're probably going to get less followers even if they have a better physique, because again, most people are not interested in, first of all, your physique, let alone their own physique, you know? So it's like, this should not be the key defining characteristic.
Yeah, 100%. And that's actually a really great point, because even if you look at if you're someone who's into bodybuilding, you think about who you admire, you'll probably start to realize that. Like, for example, I remember when I was first getting into bodybuilding, I used to find it fascinating that Ronnie Coleman, you know, worked as a police officer at the same time as being like 8-time Mr. Olympia. I thought it was fascinating that he just showed up to his job. And despite the fact that it just did not fit his lifestyle really, you know, in terms of having to eat all these meals and stuff, he just did that. And I thought that was fascinating. And even today, like if you think of the more modern bodybuilders, like even like Ben Pakulski, he was someone I used to find fascinating when I first got into bodybuilding, because I thought it was so interesting that he was presenting this kind of real thoughtful approach to what he was doing. Like he was putting out all this information about, you know, nutrition and training, etc. And I was like, God, there's a lot more here than just his physique. Like I didn't like his physique, but I paid far more attention to him than someone like, I don't know, Jay Cutler or something, who maybe wasn't putting out the same level of content. So yeah, again, just reinforcing the fact that there's more to it than just the body, for sure.
100%. Anyway, Gary, where can people find us? Because coaching is basically closed now. I think you have a few spots maybe to fill.
Yeah, I do still have a few spots available, guys. So if you do want to work with me, you can go ahead and do that. And similarly, Brian, if you're looking for nutrition only coaching, if you don't want training and nutrition, you can sign up with us as well. So do reach out. The information is, or you can just reach out to us, info@triagemethod.com, or alternatively, you can just drop any of us a message on our respective social media. You'll find me at Skinny Gaz, Paddy at The Real Paddy Farrell, Triage at Triage Method, and Brian at Brian O'Hingasa. So just reach out to us there if you need any more info. We do have to wrap this up quickly, so just briefly, you know where to find us, guys. All the relevant info is below in the description box, so you can check out all of the other content and services we offer there. And of course, if you have any suggestions for the podcast in subsequent weeks, any questions you'd like to submit or anything, you can also do that below.
Fantastic. See you later, guys.